study some Azure, let me know what you think, and subscribe. Such a nerd. I don't know why that was so enjoyable. Hey everybody, what's up? Mike here, back with Nerdy Tech. Today we're gonna be learning about Azure. Specifically, we're gonna get in the weeds a little bit, and you're going to create your first VM. So that's the first thing we're gonna do, create a VM. Second, we are going to log into it so that you can SSH to it and be able to manage it and that sort of thing. And then third, I'm gonna show you how to tweak some of the firewall rules associated with that VM by default. And in another video, we will go much further into the weeds on the firewall part. So we're just gonna kind of scratch the surface there, but again, we will cover it in depth in another video. So let's get to it. You know, just pointing this out, a lot of people think I edit a ton, but actually a lot of this stuff is like one take and you get what you get. I don't know. All right, so here we are inside of the portal. I'm not sure why I told you that, but we're in the portal right now in Azure. Our first objective was to create a virtual machine. So let's do that. And by the way, if you're brand new to the portal, hopefully you've at least signed up for your free account. If you have, that's a great starting point. That's essentially where we're at. So from here, we're going to go on the left side. You have this menu right here. And this is where you'll see your favorites. So you won't always see virtual machines here, but in most cases, you should see it right when you open it up. That is definitely one of the most popular services in Azure. If you don't, for some reason, you can click all services right here. I'll click that. And then once that comes up, you can actually filter. In this case, I see virtual machines here as well, but you could also filter here to find it. If we do virtual, yeah, there you go. It's right there. Another thing you can always do within Azure, again, assuming you're brand new, the search bar at the top is really good too. So we could type virtual machines and just simply click that. So you've got a few ways to get where we're going. In my case, I'm gonna go ahead and click that since that's the last one we're kind of testing. We do have an existing virtual machine here, but we're not going to worry about this for now. And mostly because I wanna show you the actual process of getting it started up. So what we need to do first is create, right? So we go to virtual machines, we go to create, we're going to select Azure Virtual Machine and click that. Now, once that comes up, the first thing we need to answer is which subscription do we want to create this virtual machine in? If you have just signed up for your free account, this is an easy decision because you have one subscription. If you click my dropdown, I actually have a dev and a prod subscription, and I'll just leave it in the prod one. And then also you select a resource group. So again, if you're brand new to the concept of resource groups, I did a video that covers all of the details of what they are and how we can use them. In a nutshell, they're just kind of a container for us to put resources in Azure. And a resource could be a virtual machine, a network interface, an NSG, that's firewall policy. It could be anything, right? It could be a network. So just about anything is a resource in Azure that can be placed inside of a resource group. It's a mandatory kind of construct within Azure. So in our case, if you do not, if you have not created anything up until now, which I'm going to assume you have not, you can leave this to the default. It says new resource group. It will create a resource group based on the naming convention of your virtual machine. In a production environment, this probably isn't ideal, but for the sake of just testing and creating your first virtual machine, I think it's fine. So we're not going to create a resource group currently. We're going to leave that to new and let it just create its own. Virtual machine, so let's give it a name. So I'm going to say maybe this is going to be maybe I plan on installing, I don't know, WordPress or something, or some kind of web server, I don't know. Let's just say, I'll make it simple. I'll just say WebVM 5, something like that. And you'll see here above that, right, resource group, what I said before, it's telling us what the actual name is going to be now of the resource group, web-vm5-_group. Next, we specify region availability zone. We can leave that all to the default for right now. Again, I did do a video covering availability zones and the implications here of selecting, zone 1, 2, 3, and so on. So I'm not going to cover that in this video. So you can leave that to the default for now, but definitely recommend watching that video and getting familiar with availability zones. That's a pretty major concept within Azure. Continuing down, we have the image. This is kind of the next important thing. Now, for your very first VM, I would recommend just leaving this as is. But just so you know, if you did want to deploy something else, you can click this drop down and you get a few other options. Here's a Windows Server 2019 instance. We have 2022 down here. We have Oracle Linux, Red Hat, you name it, right? If you don't see what you're looking for here, you can also click See All Images. And if you click that, it kind of takes us to the marketplace. And then from here, you can search and filter and find what you're looking for. But in our case, I'm going to actually go back and let's see if that will. There we go. Okay. And actually, I shouldn't have done that because I ruined my name, but we'll see. We're okay. So WebVM5 is our name. That's the only thing we really did. Again, if you want to see all images, see all images. From there, you can also, I'd say kind of the next key thing is the size. So by default, it's going to put us in this 1 vCPU, 3.5 gig memory instance, which is called DS1_V2. And it tells us what the cost is per month. I like to kind of think of this as, this is what I'm gonna pay if I screw up and leave it powered on. In this case, same thing here. If you click the drop down, you can select other versions. You can also do see all images or see all sizes. And if we click that again, that takes us here. And you can actually see, again, you can filter on a bunch of different things if you need a lot of RAM, a lot of vCPU, whatever. Again, though, DS1V2 is the smallest here, so that's perfectly fine. And I'm actually going to just click it and hit select. All right, from there, if we scroll down, it's going to ask us, how do we want to authenticate to this VM? How do we want to log in? Do we want to use an SSH public key when we SSH in? Or do we want to use just kind of a regular password, right? The recommendation is definitely to use a public key. So I'm gonna show you how to do that. So we'll leave that to the default. Now, the one thing you do want to take note, this will be the username that you log in with when you SSH. So you kind of do want to take note of that. You know, if you've ever done anything at all with Linux or, you know, VMs and that sort of thing, and you've tried to SSH in, you will know that, you know, a lot of times it's root or admin. It is Azure user by default. You can obviously change that if you'd like. All right, so now for the key. So if we leave everything to the default, it's going to force us to basically download this key that we are generating, the private key, right? So the private key is what we actually kind of present to be able to get access to our virtual machine. I would recommend if you're playing around in a lab, it's perfectly fine to just have one key per virtual machine. But if you're going at a slightly larger scale and you're getting a little more serious, or you just want to fool around, you can technically share a key. If you click this drop down, it says use existing key store in Azure or use existing public key. You can do that. Not the best from a security standpoint, because if someone, you know, if that key is compromised, it gives them access to a lot of things. But that's not the point here. The point here is to deploy your first VM, but I want you to be aware of some of those implications. Next, it's going to give you the name of the key pair that you'll be downloading. Now, I recommend just leaving this to default because the nice thing is it's very predictable and we can, you know, very quickly, if I deploy a VM, I will know automatically at the command line which file to reference without even knowing the file name, right? Because I just can put it together. It's always the VM name underscore key. From there, if we scroll down, it says inbound port rules. This is basically when the firewall policy is applied to this VM, which we're going to look at, what do we want to be enabled by default for inbound? In this case, it's set to SSH by default for a Linux VM, and it would be RDP or 3389 for a Windows VM. So in this case, I'm going to leave this okay. You know, I'm going to leave it to allow selected ports SSH. Just be aware, though, that does technically open a hole so that inbound traffic can access your VM on that port from the internet. And again, obviously, if you say none, nothing can, right? One thing I want to tell you, just kind of something to be aware, it's a very bad habit of mine that I will fill out this and just hit review, create, and I can change things later. But you do see this button right here. It says disks. And if you scroll to the top, all of these links here, these kind of let you jump to different, you know, areas of configuration for the VM, but not all of them are required. So just be aware of that. Technically, we could hit review and create and kind of skip a lot of these, but if we hit next for disks, just to show you what it looks like, I'm not going to change anything. It'll say we have an OS disk size of 30 gigs by default. It's going to be premium SSD. That is on locally redundant storage. Locally redundant storage, if we click this drop down, you'll see we also have something called zone redundant storage. There's these different types: locally redundant, geo-redundant, redundant storage in general. I cover this in my new AZ-900 course. It is not released as of this. Well, okay, let me rephrase. I have an AZ-900 course that hopefully, if you're watching this a month later, it's released. And if it's in the next 2 weeks, I'm sorry, it's not released yet, but it will be soon. But I cover all of the different kind of types of storage redundancy and draw it all out on the iPad and all of that, which I think is really helpful because that was a very hard concept for me to grasp when I was new at Azure. For a brand new, your first VM, leave this to the default. I just wanted to show you this stuff is there. And we can obviously add additional disks down here if we needed to or wanted to. In this case, I don't care to do that. If we go to networking, just to show you what it looks like. So it says virtual network web-vm5-vnet. So a VNet is just a virtual network that can contain multiple subnets within it. Now, if we don't select one, just like the resource group, it's going to create its own. That's probably not ideal. We probably don't want every VM to have its own network. From a scale standpoint, that'd be a big nightmare, right? So normally we would want to have a VNet already created here that we could select. Again, for your first VM, you can leave this to the default, but in subsequent videos, I'll show you guys how to actually create a VNet that we can reuse for new VMs. Same thing here, it's going to ask us for a subnet. This subnet will be created inside of that VNet. Like I said, you can have multiple subnets inside of a VNet. That's perfectly fine. Next, it's going to ask us if we want a public IP. If we do not, we'll have a hard time logging into the VM, but that is an option. So you can select none if you don't need one. You'll still have a private IP accessible within your VNet by other VMs. Just be aware of that. So next, it's going to ask us for NIC, Network Security Group. We're going to leave this to basic. If you were to say none, this would apply no firewall rules whatsoever to your VM by default, which is probably not ideal. So we're going to leave it to basic. If you select advanced, that's where you can apply your own network security group or firewall policy. So again, going back to my previous example, if we created our own policy, we wanted to reuse it, we could select that here. And that would probably be ideal, but for the sake of just testing, we're gonna stick with basic here. All right, next, same thing we saw before, right? It's going to allow SSH, that's fine. I like to select delete public IP and NIC when VM is deleted. It's just a habit of mine just to make sure that because technically if you delete the VM, the public IP can stay available and stay as one of your resources. In my case, I don't really care about that. So I do want that to disappear with my VM. We don't want to do any load balancing. We'll leave that to none. I think from there, that's pretty much it. I'm not going to go over the other tabs for now. So we'll just hit review and create. And it's going to go through this brief validation process. It takes probably about 5 to 10 seconds. We see at the top here, it does say validation passed. That looks good. If you saw a little red X over any of these categories, that would mean you missed something. So you'd have to go back and change the config. Maybe the format for the naming was off. Maybe something was too long, that kind of thing. That's good though. I think we're in good shape. So we're gonna go ahead and click create. That's it. Step one is complete. We created our first VM. Now our next step is to gain access to that VM, and we're going to need to use that private key. And I know you're at this point saying, Mike, I never got the private key. Let's check the screen. Hopefully I don't edit a lot out, so I guess that just made the video. But the point is, we now get prompted after we hit create. It says generate new key pair. Remember, I said we're not sharing a key among multiple VMs currently. We could, but we're not. So in this case, every time I create a VM, it's going to ask me to download that key. And that key will be necessary when I go to SSH into this VM. So in my case, I'm going to click download private key and create resource. That will kick off the deployment. And I'm gonna go ahead and make sure I place this somewhere that I can easily find it. I'll say Azure YouTube video new VM is the folder name. Pretty original. That's going to be real fun to type in the command line. I should have thought that one through. Anyway, the point is I've now downloaded that PEM file, and now we're ready to access the VM once it's deployed. So in this case, if we want to monitor the deployment, we can stay right here if we would like. You don't have to. You can navigate off of this if you'd like. I can go to my dashboard, the home, and in the top right, you'll see this bell, and you see that little line moving across. If we click that, that shows us the status of any open events, notifications that we have going on, things like creating a new VM. And we can see it says deployment in progress right here. And once it's done, it will look like the ones below it. It'll say go to resource, pin to dashboard. If you click go to resource, it'll just simply take you to the page for that one resource, which we can do, but I want to show you a little bit of a different way. So we're going to let this finish deploying. It should be done any second now. And there we have it. Deployment completed. True story, I froze while I was waiting because I thought it was going to be done like in literally 1 second. We do see it says go to resource, deployment succeeded, that's fine. Like I said, you could click this if you want. I'm gonna go ahead and X out of the notifications though. To access it, we see that in the middle of this front page on our portal, we see recent resources we've accessed, right? So we do see Web VM 5, and it's important also in Azure to always look at the type, because some of these, if you glance at them, you might think, like this one, right? Web VM group. I guess the naming kind of gives it away, but it tells you what specifically kind of resource it is. It's just a helpful thing to glance at this little field. But in our case, we could click on that VM, obviously, to go to it, and we probably will, but we could also go back to virtual machines, search it, whatever, and just kind of go in the way we came from the beginning. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and click on Web VM 5. And the things I'm looking for here, first of all, the most important is the IP, because our next step is to access this VM. So in this case, you want to make sure you're under the overview section of the VM. It'll say the name of the resource you're accessing is here, and it'll say what kind of resource or the type right below it. So that's a very, very important tip when you're navigating Azure, is to always look at that. That way you'll know what you're modifying. From there, if you're under the overview tab, if you look on the right side and go about halfway down the page under properties right here, we see networking, and we see public IP, we see a private IP. So if we did not select that public IP, there was like a drop down. If we had said none, it would still be fine. It would just have a private IP only and not a public. So in this case, if we want to SSH to this VM, which we do, that's the IP we need. So I'm going to pull up my terminal and let's SSH into it. All right, so here my terminal is. I just went ahead and navigated to the correct folder where that key is. We can see it. I'm going to make the text a little more readable for you. Let me expand that, and let's move that over so we can see our IP. All right, so here's the terminal. If I do an ls inside of that folder, just again, I'm using a Mac, but just to see what's inside of that folder, I see that we do have that key. This is that private key that we downloaded when we were finishing creating the VM. Now, I want to show you something. So if we just go SSH -I is the command to specify that private key. Then we do quotation marks and we specify the name. We can actually use tab, by the way, just to autocomplete. A lot of people don't know that. But in this case, we specify the name of that VM. And then from there, we specify the username. So again, this is not root. This is not admin. It is Azure user at the IP that we have down here. So that is going to be 172.171.243.114. All right. So let's go ahead and hit enter and see what happens. Okay, it says, are you sure you want to continue connecting? Yes. And then look at this. We get unprotected private key file. And it says permission 0644 for webvm5_key.pem are to open. And it says it is required that your private key files are not accessible by others. So basically it's saying you're not following good security hygiene because that private key is something that some other user could actually view the contents of it and therefore get access into the system. So what we actually have to do is run a command specifically to make sure that only the owner has read access. So in this case, I'm going to do a chmod 400. That's going to make sure that I, as the owner, have read access, but nobody else does, essentially. From that point, we'll specify the file name. It's going to be web web-vm5 underscore key.pem. That's it. If we hit enter, that looks good. If we just up arrow twice and I run that same command to SSH in, and by the way, if you're using a Windows system and you're using like PuTTY or something, this is all fairly straightforward. Really, your goal is to make sure you specify the key, make sure the permissions are not as open, right? So we just need read access for the owner, not for everybody else. In this case, though, if I hit enter now that we have fixed those permissions, let's see what happens. Beautiful thing. We see that we now, our prompt has changed. We see kind of this login message come across. Welcome to Ubuntu 20.04.6 LTS. So we're no longer on my Mac, my local system. We see Azure user at webvm5. That's our prompt. If we do an ls, we see actually a pwd. We see our folder name. We're in the home directory of Azure user, right? So we are now logged into our VM in Azure. So that's good. We're done with that. So I'm going to actually close that out. We'll just X out of that. And now what I want to shift to showing you is how to manage the firewall policy that allowed us to log into that VM in the first place. So remember, we're still at the virtual machine overview page here. And if we go ahead and scroll up, we can see that we are currently attached to virtual network subnet webvm5-vnet. Now, I want to be very clear about when we talk about NSGs or network security groups, that's firewall policy, by the way. When we talk about those, you can attach those primarily in two places. One, directly to the network interface of a VM, and two, to a subnet. So we could attach a VNet, or I'm sorry, an NSG firewall policy directly to a subnet so it affects all VMs in that VNet. But by default, the way we deployed this VM, it is actually directly attached to this VM. And I want to prove that to you. So if I go over to network settings under networking here for this VM, I'm going to click that. And on the right side, we should see right here, look at this, network security group, webvm5-nsg. We didn't create that. That was auto-created. And that policy, by the way, we could click on it if we want to view that policy for that NSG, but we could also scroll down. It's right here. So this is actually showing me essentially the inbound port rules. So this is inbound traffic coming to me. I'm the VM. And then we also have outbound down here. If we want to expand that, we can see that as well. Now you see here, the only thing that's not grayed out is priority 300. Lower priority is processed before higher priorities. I know that sounds weird. Or I should say a lower number is a higher priority. So in this case, it would be processed top-down. That means our SSH rule right here, which was created for us automatically when we created that VM, that is the first one here. And it's pretty wide open. We can see that it essentially is allowing TCP port 22 from any source to any destination. It's going to allow it. Now, we could obviously click this trash can to just delete it, but that doesn't do us much good. But also, we don't love the idea that anybody in the world right now could SSH into this VM. So if we want to update it, what we could do is click on the name of that rule right here. So it says SSH and there's a little, exclamation mark or whatever that is. I don't know, triangle thing. If we click on that, it's going to then give us some options of things we can change. We can change the source, destination. The only thing we can't change is the port. That is because we have selected the service here, or the system has selected the service by default. So for example, if I were to change that to HTTP, you'll see it changes the port number right here. It's now 80. So SSH is fine. There is also a, if we don't select, yeah, there we go. If we go custom, you can specify whatever port number you want here. In this case, we'll just leave it to SSH, but just want to show you kind of at a very high level how that works. I will be covering that a lot more in subsequent videos. We'll be going over all of this in detail, but in this case, I just want to show you one thing, right? I said that at the beginning of the video, we'd create a VM, we'd log into it, and then we tighten down the security just a little bit for our test VMs. So what I would recommend is go to the source, and if you click that, that's going to allow you to specify a specific source, a specific IP address that you want to be able to access your VM on SSH, TCP/22. You could also specify this pretty cool like little macro here, my IP address. So if I select my IP address, it will insert my personal IP at my house, my modem. It will insert that IP into the firewall policy. So now only I can, or I guess my kids could access it, but if they log into my VM on Azure, I'm just gonna go buy them ice cream, to be honest with you. But anyway, the point is that someone from this place could access it, right? And that's fine. That's probably what I want. So I don't want people from, I don't know, Canada accessing it. No offense to my Canadian viewers, but you guys log into some stuff you shouldn't be logging into. Just kidding. Okay, so from here, that's it, right? So we could select my IP address and tighten it down. I would recommend you probably do and hit save. I'm not going to change it for right now because my IP doesn't really change that often. But yeah, that's essentially it, right? So we created the VM, we logged in, we tightened it down a little bit. That's it. If you have followed along up until this point, do me a favor and let me know in the comments because I'm super impressed. Like seriously, hats off to you. Like that's awesome. If you didn't quite follow along, but this video was still helpful, let me know that as well. It is very useful to know if all of the work put into these videos, if it's useful to anybody. In addition to that, make sure you subscribe while you're here. I have, I think last I checked, I have 13 hours of videos filmed that have not yet released. So I've got a lot of Azure content coming out in sooner than later. So you'll see it kind of trickling out. So I don't want to put timelines on all of it, but obviously weekly videos is a thing. So that said, I hope you guys stay safe and healthy. And until next time, stay nerdy, take care of each other,